This is the second in a series of videos correcting various claims made about the Islamic Golden Age. See the first video in this series for the context. This video addresses claims about which Greek and Roman texts were available to Western scholars during the Middle Ages. It is claimed that European scholars lost nearly all the Greek and Latin scientific texts after the fall of the Roman Empire. Alison Abbott, senior European correspondent for the scientific journal Nature, claims that by the 15th century, quote, many Arabic works had by then been translated into Latin, but the sources themselves were neglected, end quote. In reality, the Greek sources of those Arabic translations were not neglected. Most of the Greek knowledge which was preserved independently of the Muslim world. Even without the help of the Muslim scholars, our knowledge of Greek mathematics and science would be virtually the same as it is now. It is true that when the Roman Empire collapsed, Western European scholars found their access to Greek classical writings severely limited. One significant contributing factor was the repeated Viking raids on monasteries. Monasteries were ideal targets for raids since their inhabitants had no military training or weapons and could easily be killed or enslaved. Additionally, monasteries often held valuable items made from precious metals and gemstones, which were attractive loot. During the Viking Age, many monasteries throughout England suddenly disappear off the map, completely wiped out and often burned to the ground. The Anglo-Saxons themselves were aware of the damage this caused to their literary heritage. Historian Peter Sawyer wrote that in the 9th century, King Alfred the Great lamented the damage the Viking raids had caused to the scholarly tradition in England, saying, quote, before everything was ransacked and burned, the churches throughout England stood filled with treasures and books, end quote. Similarly, classical scholars Leighton Durham Reynolds and Nigel Guy Wilson explain that, quote, the stocks of classical books in Britain had been devastated by the Viking raids and other disorders of the 9th century, and recovery was slow, end quote. A more serious challenge to the study of the classics was the rise of Latin as the lingua franca of the West, so that after the fall of the Roman Empire, knowledge of Greek became scarce and Greek texts could not be read. Reynolds and Wilson explain that, quote, with the decline of the empire, Greek fell out of use except in the south of Italy and Sicily, end quote. So study of the classics in the West was limited by Viking theft and destruction as well as lack of Greek literacy. It was not because the classical texts themselves were being neglected. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy explains, quote, they were lost not in the sense that the texts were simply unavailable, but in the sense that very few people could read them, since they were written in the wrong language, end quote. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article continues by explaining that even though there was a scarcity of primary Greek philosophical texts in the West, knowledge of Greek philosophy had also been preserved in Christian philosophical commentaries on Plato and Aristotle, written by theologians such as Tertullian, Victorinus, Ambrose, Themistius, Ammonius, Simplicius of Cilicia, Boethius, and John Philoponus. Consequently, the article comments, quote, it is also important to recognize that the medievals knew a good deal about Greek philosophy anyway, end quote. Similarly, historian of philosophy Frederick Copleston wrote that modern research into the transmission of the Greek classics has shown, quote, it can no longer be said that the medievals had no real knowledge of Aristotle, end quote. Although scientific progress in Western Europe was delayed by a combination of a lack of classical sources and widespread illiteracy, especially of Greek, study of the Greek classical literature was carefully fostered within the Christian Church, and the monasteries in particular proved to be essential to the preservation and study of Greek philosophical and proto-scientific commentary. Physicist John Freely observed that, quote, the development of the monastic movement not only increased literacy, but it produced the first European scientists who had laid the foundations for the emergence of modern science, end quote. In England, classical studies continued to flourish under the patronage of church leaders. Freely relates that the English bishop Benedict Biscop, 7th century, made 5 trips to Rome in order to collect Greek classical texts for monastic libraries in England, where they could be preserved and studied. As a result of Benedict's efforts, the library of his abbey became famous in Europe for its collection of classical literature. Freely also describes how Benedict brought other scholars to England to help foster the preservation and study of the Greek classics. The most famous of these were Theodore of Tarsus, a Greek, and Hadrian the African, a Berber from North Africa. Theodore and Hadrian were highly influential on the development of the English academic tradition. Freely wrote that they, quote, founded a monastic school in Canterbury that began what has been called the Golden Age of Anglo-Saxon scholarship, end quote. The 8th century Anglo-Saxon historian Bede wrote that their school, quote, attracted a large number of students into whose minds they poured the waters of wholesome knowledge day by day, end quote. Arguably their most influential contribution was the teaching of Greek, in addition to arithmetic and physical science. According to the historian Bede, some of their students could speak Greek and Latin with native-level fluency. Bede himself was a competent scholar who made several scientific contributions of his own, such as explaining how the Earth's spherical shape resulted in the differing length of daylight throughout the year. Remarkably, Bede also deduced the effect of the moon on tides, attributing it to a force exerted by the moon itself. Speaking of the tidal rise and fall of the sea, he wrote, quote, "It is as if it were dragged forwards against its will by certain exhalations of the moon, and when her power ceases, it is poured back again into his proper measure," end quote. This was a remarkable conclusion given the fact that the concept of gravity was still centuries in the future. Bede's observations on the causal effect of the moon on the tides was in fact far ahead of all his peers. Muslim contributions to the understanding of the tides were not made until a century later, when Persian astrologer Abu Ma'ashar made independent observations on the relationship of the moon and tides. However, his work did not become available to Western scholars until the 12th century, and his view that the tides were caused by the properties of the moon's light, which he incorrectly believed was generated by the moon and heated the Earth's seas, was wrong. Also in the 12th century, the Spanish Arab astronomer al-Bitruji suggested an alternative explanation of the tides, which was likewise wrong, attributing them to the movement of the heavens. Bede was correct in deducing that the moon was exerting some kind of attractive force at a distance, which caused the movement of the Earth's bodies of water. However, he was so far ahead of his time that this theory was not developed further until 1608, when the Flemish mathematician Simon Stevin argued strongly for a model like Bede's. The next year, in 1609, German astrologer and mathematician Johannes Kepler proposed a kind of gravitational power as an explanation for Bede's mysterious attractive force. This was famously refined by Isaac Newton, who introduced a unified model of gravity which not only explained the moon's effects on the tides, but the relationship of the sun, moon, and planets to each other. Having been reignited in the 7th century, the Western academic tradition continued to develop without interruption, as the Greek philosophical texts were copied and studied by important scholars such as Alcuin of York in the 8th century, John Scotus in the 9th century, and Adelard of Bath in the 12th century, all of whom made important contributions to the foundations of Western science. Classical scholars Leighton Durham Reynolds and Nigel Guy Wilson describe this period as, quote, the classical revival of the late 8th and early 9th centuries, end quote, under the Frank King Charlemagne, during which time Greek texts were reintroduced to formal education programs in Western Europe. They further comment that this was, quote, without doubt the most momentous and critical stage in the transmission of the legacy of Rome, end quote. Reynolds and Wilson also describe how Charlemagne hired Alcuin of York to, quote, take charge of his palace school and be his advisor on educational matters, end quote. It was Alcuin's work which reintroduced the study of the Greek classics into the 8th century European educational curriculum. Far from being a time when the Greek classics were lost to Western scholars, the wrongly named Dark Ages were in fact a time when these texts were being carefully copied and enthusiastically studied, and when valuable contributions to science were being made as a result. Reynolds and Wilson describe how Western scholars during Charlemagne's reign conducted a large-scale campaign of searching out classical manuscripts from all over Europe, saying, quote, the copying of books went on apace through the length and breadth of Charlemagne's empire, end quote. This campaign was a major contributing factor to the preservation of the extant classical literature in the West. According to Reynolds and Wilson, by the end of the 9th century, quote, some authors were so well entrenched in the literary and educational tradition, and so thick on the shelves of the libraries, that their survival was no longer in question, end quote. So even though the availability of the Greek classical texts in Western Europe was extremely limited, neither the texts nor the knowledge of them was ever completely lost. Not only were they still studied, but gradual progress in scientific knowledge continued to be made. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, where Greek remained the lingua franca of the Byzantine Empire, the situation was far better, and almost all of the available Greek philosophical tradition was preserved. Peter Adamson, professor of philosophy at the University of Munich, writes, quote, in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the Greek-speaking Byzantines could continue to read Plato and Aristotle in the original, end quote. Historian of philosophy Christina d'Ancona says, quote, at the end of the 5th century and during the 6th, within a Christian environment, both in Alexandria and in Athens, the Neoplatonic schools continued to comment upon Aristotle and Plato, end quote. In their review of the historical transmission of Greek texts, scholars Reynolds and Wilson note that from the 9th century onwards, there was, quote, a practically continuous tradition of classical studies in Byzantium, end quote, during which time numerous classical Greek works were copied, studied, and used as textbooks. Professor of ancient philosophy Katharina Ierodiaconou likewise says that the Byzantine Christians, quote, had access to most of the major ancient texts we still have, end quote, adding that there are at least 1,000 Byzantine Greek copies of, or commentaries on, Aristotle, and over 260 copies of Plato's dialogues. In fact, historical evidence demonstrates that although some Greek texts were eventually transmitted from Muslims to Western Europeans, it was the European Christians in the East who were responsible for transmitting most Greek texts to the Muslims in the first place.